solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you
Yes.
God.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
State your name, please.
Geri Russo?
And the last name is spelled R-U-S-S-O.
Yes.
And where do you work? I'm sorry, Geri is?
G-E-R-I.
That's probably the more difficult one. There's probably more variations. And where do you work?
I work for Digital Risk.
And what type of company is that?
Digital Risk does reviews of defaulted mortgages and also origination mortgages.
And how long have you lived there?
I've been
there. How long have you worked there? I'm sorry.
I've been there most recently for about a year and a half, and I've worked there previously in the past also for just over a year, but I had about a year's gap in employment.
Okay. And do you know George Zimmerman?
I do.
And how do you know him?
I worked with George at Digital Risk.
Okay. Was that then during that first 1 year period that you worked at Digital Risk, or more recently?
It was both times.
Okay. Correct, and that Mrs. Zimmerman was there while you were there. You left for a little while. He still worked there. You came back, and he was still working there.
That's correct.
Okay. And would you consider yourself a friend of George Zimmerman's?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And also, obviously, a coworker.
Yes.
Even during the year that you weren't working there, would you keep in touch with George, Mrs. Zimmerman?
Yes, we did keep in touch.
Did you know his wife as well?
I did not know her personally, no.
But yet you kept in touch with George Zimmerman even for the year that you weren't working there?
Yes.
And when you came back then, how often would you see him on a weekly basis?
I would say sometimes daily or several times a week. It just varied, but quite often.
Okay. Have an ability to interact with him on almost a daily basis?
Yes.
Hear his voice?
Yes.
And if you can tell us, if you can, we're sort of using the term sort of a spectrum of different voices, anything from conversational tone, yelling, laughing. You sort of tell us, to the extent that you've heard him speak in different ways. Tell us about that.
Normal conversation, personal conversation, work conversation. I've heard him speak in English. I've heard him speak in Spanish.
You've heard him laughing or yelling?
I've heard him laughing, not yelling.
And my understanding is, of course, while we're here, the event that happened on February 26th of 2012, correct?
Yes.
And did you speak to him just after that event?
It wasn't just after that event, but it was sometime in the year after that. I couldn't be exactly sure what date.
Okay. Do you recall, if you can, how far after or long after the event of the shooting that you spoke with him?
My best estimate would be a couple of months before he returned to Seminole County.
Okay. That's when he was out of Seminole County before he came back?
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to listen to what we were calling the Lauer 911 call, the tape? I'm going to play it for you, and let me know if you have an opinion as to whose voice it is, okay?
Yes.
I might have just a moment, Your Honor. I'm going to play it one time straight through. If you want me to play it a second time, let me know. And if you want me to go back to a particular portion of it, let me know, okay?
Okay.
911, do you need police, fire, medical?
Maybe both. I'm not sure. There's just someone screaming outside.
Okay, what's the address that they're near?
1211 Twin Trees Lane.
Twin Trees Lane? Is this in the Twin Lake Homes in Sanford?
Yeah.
Okay. And is it a male or female?
It sounds like a male.
And you don't know why?
I don't know why. I think they're yelling help, but I don't know. Just send someone quick. Say stop.
Okay. Does he look hurt? You
I can't see him. I don't want to go out there. I don't know what's going on. So they're sending him.
So you think he's yelling help?
Yes.
All right. What is your phone number?
Just there's gunshots.
Have you heard that tape before?
Yes, I have.
If you would tell the jury how many times or when and circumstances.
I've heard it less than half a dozen times, and mostly on the TV news. The first time I heard it was on the news.
Okay. And were you able, well, first of all, do you have an opinion as to whose voice that is?
Yes.
And whose voice is that? And let me premise it this. We know that we hear someone in the foreground, a person by the name of Ms. Lauer, who's talking to the 911 operator. Could you hear the noise or the yelling in the background?
Yes, I could.
Can you identify whose voice that was yelling in the background?
George's.
Okay. And how do you know that?
I recognize his voice. I've heard him speak many times. I have no doubt in my mind that's his voice.
You said that you've heard the tape several times. Is that mainly listening to it on TV?
Yes.
Were you able to identify Mr. Zimmerman's voice during the very first time that you listened to it?
Yes, my immediate reaction was, that's George's voice.
Was anyone there prompting you in any way to identify the voice as one particular person over another?
No.
Is this just something that you listened to on TV by yourself or with family members?
I was in my home. I had background the first time they played it, and I believe I was by myself.
If I might have a moment, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions of this witness?
Thank you. Cross?
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Ms. Russo, actually, you would characterize yourself as a good friend of the defendant's, correct?
A good friend, a work friend.
Well, but you and he would communicate outside of work as well, true?
Occasionally, yes.
You would text him,
Occasionally,
he would
yes.
text you back.
Occasionally, yes.
Tell the members of the jury, if you would, when's the first time you heard that tape that was just played for you? You said you heard it on the news. My question is when?
When? I would say soon after it was initially released to the media.
Do you recall what month that was?
I do not.
You understood at that time that George Zimmerman was under investigation for the murder of Trayvon Martin?
I don't know at the point that I heard the tape that he was under investigation, no.
He wasn't at work, was he?
No.
Where did you think he was?
All I knew is that he was out of work.
You had no idea that he was being
No, I
investigated
didn't.
about the
Well,
murder
let
of
me
Trayvon
clarify.
Martin?
You're asking, I knew about the incident that occurred, but as far as whether he was under any type of particular investigation, I recall at the particular moment that I heard that on the news that there was a active investigation. If I said I knew that or I didn't know that, I'd be guessing.
Why did you think he wasn't at work?
Initially, I thought he was out sick. Then I heard he was out on FMLA.
But you're telling this jury you had no idea he was being investigated for that murder?
No, I'm not telling them that. I'm saying at the time that I heard the 911 call on the news, I can't recall at this moment, if I knew at that very moment that he was under investigation. If I said that I knew that, I'm just guessing. Okay. The assumption is that, yes, he was. Why else would it be on the news? But I would just be guessing.
All right. But you knew at the time you heard the tape that he had shot Trayvon Martin?
Yes.
Okay. And you know now he's actually charged with the second-degree murder of Trayvon Martin?
Yes, of course I do.
So when you heard the tape, you wanted to believe it was George Zimmerman's voice screaming for help?
No. When I heard the tape, my immediate reaction was, that's George screaming for help.
Did you want to believe it was Trayvon Martin?
There wasn't a matter of believing or wanting to believe who it was. I recognized it to be George's voice.
But you've never heard him yell before, right?
No, I have not.
Never heard him scream?
No.
So you don't know what he sounds like when he screams, do you?
No, but the voice I recognized was that of George Zimmermans.
Did you ever hear Trayvon Martin speak?
No, I have not.
Did you ever hear him yell?
No, I have not.
So you have no idea what Trayvon Martin sounds like
No,
when
I
he
do
yells,
not.
do you?
No.
Thank you, Judge.
Very, very briefly, Your Honor. You understand now that he was actually Mr. Zimmerman was out of state just shortly after the shooting, correct?
Yes.
That's calling for speculation.
I think, Your Honor.
Well, it'd be sustained unless she knows.
Okay. Do you know, well, I don't know how to ask it without asking it, so I will. Did you know where Mr. Zimmerman was just after the shooting?
I didn't know his exact location, but I knew he was not in the state of Florida.
You knew that he had to leave the state?
Yes.
And that at first there was police investigation, correct?
I believe so, yes. There was a shooting.
And that he was not charged with a crime immediately, was he?
Judge, I'll object to that again unless she has that information. I just asked him to rephrase the question.
I'll rephrase it. Do you know how long it was before charges were filed against him?
I believe it was a couple of months.
Okay, so you know that he was not charged initially by the police, correct?
Correct.
And that he wasn't charged until the Fourth Circuit came down from Jacksonville and charged him?
Judge, again, I object to leave.
Sustained.
Do you know who charged him with second-degree murder?
I don't know exactly who charged him, but I know he was charged.
Do you know whether or not the 18th Judicial Circuit, this circuit, charged him?
I believe there was a special prosecutor involved.
You were asked when the first time was. I think he asked you the question, didn't you really want it to be George? Weren't you hopeful that it was George Zimmerman screaming? And what was your answer?
I just immediately recognized it as George's voice. There was no hoping it was one person or the other.
And you understand that you're under oath as you sit here today,
Yes,
correct?
I do.
Is your friendship with Mr. Zimmerman, any hopes you may have as to the outcome of this case, is that affecting your testimony here today?
Absolutely not.
If it was your opinion that it was not George Zimmerman's voice on the tape, would you testify to that as well?
Yes, I would.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. May Ms. Russo be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you very much. You are excused. Please call your next witness.
I'd like to suggest the time for the morning break if we're going to take one.
Do you all need a break? Ladies and gentlemen?
Refer to that.
They're good. Call your next witness, please.
Leeanne Benjamin. Recently.
It was both times.
Okay. Correct, then that Mrs. Zimmerman was there while you were there. You left for a little while. He still worked there. You came back and he was still working there.
That's correct.
And would you consider yourself a friend of George Zimmerman's?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And also, obviously, a co-worker.
Yes.
Even during the year that you weren't working there, would you keep in touch with?
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, ma'am. How are
Morning.
you? State your name, please.
Geri Russo?
And the last name is spelled R-U-S-S-O?
Yes.
And where do you work? I'm sorry, Geri is?
Geri.
That's probably the more difficult one. There's probably more variations. And where do you work?
I work for Digital Risk.
And what type of company is that?
Digital Risk.
solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you
Yes.
God?
George, Mr. Zimmerman,
Yes, we did keep in touch.
did you know his wife as well?
I did not know her personally, no.
But yet you kept in touch with George Zimmerman even for that year that you weren't working there.
Yes.
And when you came back then, how often would you see him on a weekly basis?
I would say sometimes daily or several times a week. It just varied, but quite often.
Have an ability to interact with him on almost a daily basis?
Yes.
Hear his voice?
Does reviews of defaulted mortgages and also origination mortgages.
And how long have you lived there?
I've
Lived
been
there. How long have you worked there? I'm sorry.
I've been there most recently for about a year and a half, and I've worked there previously in the past also for just over a year, but I had about a year's gap in employment.
Okay. And do you know George Zimmerman?
I do.
And how do you know him?
I worked with George at Digital Risk.
Okay. Was that then during that first 1 year period that you worked at Digital Risk, or
It-
more